Assalamu alaikum, Azul, bonjour, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adel Hamazi. I'm an associate fellow at the Chatham House MENA program. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar event, kindly hosted by our friends at the Algerian Embassy in London. Today we'll be marking a momentous date in the history of Algeria from a country whose team was knocked out just last week from the Euros, in fact, quite shamefully in the quarterfinals. أتمنى للجميع عيد استقلال السعيد. Yesterday marked 59 years, or I did the calculation through our friends at Google, 21,550 days since Algeria's hard-fought independence struggle, which is largely characterized by the culminating war for liberation between 1954 and 1962. The term exceptionalism, or to quote the dictionary, the condition of being different from the norm, is often overused, misused, manipulated, inherent biases, etc. However, most observers, academics, non-Algerian here I'm speaking, analysts and historians tend to agree that Algeria's colonial experience and liberation was truly exceptional. Next year, Algeria commemorates its 60th anniversary since independence, its own diamond jubilee. And like many, in the period ahead, we hope Algeria can emerge from the pandemic, making the necessary political and economic reforms required on the path to prosperity as the country enters its 7th decade. Today, however, we look back in order to look forward, and we look at a few key moments, personalities, and tragedies that are synonymous with Algeria's independence struggle, including here its precursors and its own national hero. I must ask colleagues who'd like to ask a question, please do so throughout using the chat function, short and sweet, Algerian, Arabic, French, or English, or Amazigh, any language you like, and we'll work it out. But short, not sweet, no essays. I'll take the liberty of saying, since I have my Algerian hat on as well, no essays, my friends. I know us Algerians like to, sometimes simplicity is not the strength of ours, shall we say. So I ask colleagues to keep it short and sweet with the Q&A. Also, if you'd like to tweet, you can tweet at Algeria in UK, which is the embassy in London's Twitter account, and we'll take it from there. Before passing on to our esteemed academics colleagues, I asked our esteemed ambassador, His Excellency Abdurrahman bin Garrah, ambassador of Algeria to United Kingdom, to give us a few opening remarks before we go into the nitty-gritty, starting in the 19th century and moving our way to 5th of July 1962. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank our moderator and speakers for accepting our invitation. I also would like to thank all the participants and for taking the time to be present with us today. Yesterday, as you know, the Algerian people celebrated with great joy and pride the 59th anniversary of the independence of their country. This date marks not only the end of the glorious war of liberation from 1954 to 1962, but also the end of a brutal and inhumane occupation which lasted 132 years. France, as it can be imagined, justified its occupation of Algeria with fabricated accusations of the Algerian leadership at that time of piracy in high seas and offenses made to its council by the Dey of Algiers. It also presented Algeria as being largely unexploited, largely inhabited. In fact, it only inhabited by a small, immoral, godless, illiterate, and uncivilized population, so it said. This description of the Algerian people is, however, the opposite of the reports that we find in the French military archives, which indicate that at the time of the invasion, the majority of the Algerian people could read and write. These archives also describe Algerian houses as being well constructed with nice gardens, adding that unlike in metropolitan France, there were all kinds of fruits and vegetables in the local markets. So it's hardly the desert that was described. We can also consult the writings of the famous 19th century French philosopher, Alexis de Tocqueville, who in the early years of the conquest made a trip to Algeria, and he wrote, speaking of Algerian, he said, and I quote, "They all know how to read, and they have this finesse and this aptitude for understanding, which makes them so superior to our peasants in France, end of quote. Unfortunately, it's the same person, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a staunch advocate of the massacre of the Algerian population. And he wrote, and I quote, "I believe that the law of wars authorizes us to ravage the country, and that we must do so either by destroying the crops at harvest time or in all weather by making rapid incursions to seize men and herds," end of quote. So if a popular philosopher with a great reputation holds this language, you can imagine the plans of the military at that time. Unlike other colonies, France considered Algeria as an integral part. As an integral part of its territory, but it never treated its people as equal citizens. In fact, it adopted very harsh policies to dispossess them from their lands, wealth, rights, and culture. Many French and Western historians wrote that military campaigns were waged with the purpose to exterminate the Algerian population, campaigns that were very similar to those conducted against American Indians. From the start, the French encountered resistance from local tribes and also from centralized modern forces, such as that of Emir Abdel Qadir, who fought the French army for more than 15 years. He is considered as the founder of the Algerian modern state. These insurgencies, also either local or regional, were interrupted and did not stop totally until independence. The French occupant retaliated with extreme violence to the extent that just between 1830 and 1870, that is in 40 years, the Algerian population decreased by a third, according to a number of estimates and historians. Many tribes and villages were victims of genocide, and many of them were just decimated. At the first quarter of the 20th century, we witnessed the emergence of Algerian elites, some of them demanding the right to equality for all Algerians, and others asking for independence for the country. These peaceful demands took many forms, such as publication of newspapers, pamphlets, books, and organization of strikes and demonstrations. The most memorable demonstrations were those held on 8 May 1945 in some Algerian cities. These demonstrations were repressed in bloodshed by the French security forces. It is estimated that more than 45,000 Algerian unarmed civilians lost their lives on that day. Such a heavy toll left a huge scar on the Algerian people, a scar that never healed. On that day, it became clear to the leaders of the nationalist movement that independence cannot be achieved only through political and peaceful solutions. In fact, that day paved the way to the national armed struggle, which will start almost 10 years later on November 1st, 1954, in many regions of the country. This uprising quickly gained the backing of the Algerian people. The Algerian resistance also benefited from the precious support of African, Arab, and many other countries, and also won the sympathy of the international public opinion, especially after the use by France of very extreme violence and torture considered as crime against humanity. It is important to recall that France deployed in total 2.2 million soldiers in France, and I repeat, 2.2 million soldiers throughout the conflict. Many of these soldiers participated in transferring 2.5 million Algerians living in rural areas into what would they call then regroupment camps, with no permission for these people to return to their homes or leave those camps. It is clear that the Algerian people achieved a monumental victory in an asymmetric war, with a combination of a courageous military resistance, a dynamic diplomacy deployed worldwide, and with the skills demonstrated by its leaders in the negotiations leading to independence. Many historians consider the Algerian Revolution as one of the most iconic, but also the most brutal of the 20th century, with more than 1.5 million martyrs. It was also an extraordinary example of sacrifice and determination to the movements of liberation in Africa and elsewhere. These are introductory remarks that I hope have shed some light on the long struggle of the Algerian people against colonialism. I am sure the distinguished speakers will go more in depth in explaining and analyzing certain important dates, events, and roles played by some personalities, which are so crucial to the understanding of the different facets of this conflict. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for the opening remarks. You touched on a sector which is dear to me from one economist to another, which is the agricultural sector, which I'm very keen on going forward in present-day Algeria. But I was looking at a stat, and I saw that by 1944-45, which Professor Martin Evans will touch upon when consulting and taking us through 8th of May, 1.7% of the populace at the time owned a quarter of the arable land, and of course that increased in the years ahead. Very interesting prism to look at the war through I think land and agriculture. We now go to Dr. Mohammed Bouabdallah, an old friend who is lecturing humanities at Westminster University. We know each other from University of London, and it's been some time, so very pleased to see you. Dr. Bouabdallah will take us through the story of the national hero, focusing on Emir, of course, Emir Abdel Qadir, the early military leader of the Algerian resistance, and we'll touch on, I think we'll be going back 213 years. He was born in 1808, and the rest is over to you, Dr. Mohammed. My reputation as an enforcer precedes me, so please, no more than 10 minutes, and I'll give you a 1-minute warning when we get to 9. تفضل خويا. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, yes, yeah. Okay, assalamu alaikum, and very good afternoon to all of you. Many thanks for our embassy for organizing such event, and for His Excellency, the Ambassador. And thanks to my dear friend Adel, whom I haven't seen him for years now, from SAWAS. And my title is Emir Abdel Qadir, the early military leader of the Algerian resistance. Or let me borrow the term Sira Sayfiya. It's from Saif, sword, Sira Sayfiya, which is this term is used by Tom Warner Powell in his amazing book on Emir Abdel Qadir. And an arm tree on the plain of Gris, Sahel Gris, near the city of Mascara. A large assembly gathered to give allegiance, bay'ah, to 25 years old Abdel Qadir ibn Muhyiddin. This assembly included ulama, sharifs, and other notables of the tribes, Al-Ayan, including Al-Hajj Muhyiddin, the father of Al-Amir Abdel Qadir, who gave him the title of Nasir al-Din. On the day of his election, Al-Amir Abdel Qadir declared, "I accept this position of Amir, although with reluctance, hoping it will be a vehicle for uniting the Muslims, for preventing strife and dissension among them, for assuring the safety of the roads, for terminating activities which are contrary to Sharia, for protecting the country from the enemy, and for establishing law and justice for the powerful and for the feeble alike." Amir is one of the greatest figures, not only in Algerian history, but also in the history of humanity. He was a statesman, scholar, a sharif, a mujahid, and freedom fighter. We have to remember that Al-Amir started his political and military career when he was only 24. That was in 1832. In Damascus, Al-Amir was famous when he asked his Algerian Hashia to protect Christians and defend them against Muslims. And he delivered a speech which is recorded, where he said, "You are dishonoring the Prophet of God. These people have done nothing and they are to be protected." One cannot fully understand the charisma of Amir Abdel Qadir if does not delve into the seerah of Amir through his own works, archives, military and diplomatic correspondences, in addition to other primary and secondary sources written in different languages. Researchers and scholars within Western and Arab academia generally neglect the social and political milieu of Gris plain, Sahl Gris, or what is used to be called Al-Rashidiyya. This milieu and context facilitated the rise of Amir Abdel Qadir to power. Unfortunately, because of the limited time of this talk, we cannot elaborate or even highlight the importance of this region and why the allegiance took place there. And I hope we may have another opportunity in the future to talk about this. For Algerians, Amir is remembered as a national hero and great mujahid who led the first organized national resistance against the French invasion. He embarked on successful guerrilla war against one of the best equipped armies in the Western world and won. He established his own state, appointing his khulafa, governors. He even had his own currency, Muhammadiyah. 10 years ago, I designed a syllabus for my Arabic students based at the University of Westminster, based on Amir Abdel Qadir. Although it was a whole year module dedicated to different aspects of Al-Amir, we were not able to cover all the aspects of his life. In this very short talk, I will be very selective and try to reflect, and I highlight this, reflect only on how the legacy of Al-Amir, including these years of muqawama, resistance, shaped the Algerian public memory. Popular poetry, Shi'r al-Sha'bi, and songs circulating among the Algerians glorified the resistance of Al-Amir against the French colonial. And we all aware about the Qasida of Hiziyya by the great poet, Si Muhammad bin Gitoun, who praised Al-Amir in many of his songs. The memory of Al-Amir was recalled also by prominent activists in the national government, in the national movement. Salih al-Hajj, who founded several national parties, often praised Al-Amir Abdel Qadir for his fight for independence. In related to maybe what Professor Martin will mention later on about the events of the 8th of May 1945, we have to remember that Al-Amir's flag, green and white, became the symbol of the Algerian national movement fight for the independence. On the streets of Stif, Gelma, and Kharrata, the flag was shown by demonstrators calling for the liberation and the independence of Algeria. The same flag was present in procession organized by PPA, Hizb al-Sha'b al-Jazairi, Parti du Peuple Algérien, on the 14th of July 1937. That was a symbolic link between the Algerian national movement and the resistance of Al-Amir. After the event of 1945, Salih al-Hajj founded his new party, MTLD, in the National Council meeting of the new party. In 1948, the MTLD called for the return of the national hero Amir's remain to his homeland, Algeria. This alhamdulillah, happened in 1966 after the independence. What happened in October 1949 is very interesting. The French administration decided to build an obelisk dedicated to Amir, celebrating his centenary surrender. The Algerian national movement stood together to defend Al-Amir as a national hero who was hijacked by the French colonial. Salih al-Hajj, Farhat Abbas, and the PCA, Parti Communist, condemned this hypocrisy and considered this ceremony as a bluff. And I like these words. When I read it actually for the first time, I said to myself, well, this is maybe the right word to describe such action of the Governor General and his administration. Especially when you hear these words from an Algerian, as the word itself, use it in the context of our Darija. And if we want to stop someone by saying not bad things, or just saying bakamat blowfish, which is quite a good word to remind us of this policy. Let us tell them the memory of Amir Abdel Qadir does not belong to you. One of the newspapers of UDMA wrote in 1949, and maybe Dr. Malika here could tell us more about this, as she wrote, I think, a whole book on Farhat Abbas and UDMA, l'Idma. So, by the way, this condemned of the Amir's obelisk with other events leads the French to uncover the Organisation Spéciale, OS, and their failed bomb attack against Al Amir's monuments. Again, here it's a long story and we cannot elaborate on this. In 1947, in Paris, Katib Yassin published his epistle, Abdel Qadir et l'indépendance algérienne. And I hope someone will translate this into Arabic one day, which was originally a lecture delivered by Katib Yassin with the same title in La Salle de Société Savante on the 24th of May, 1947. In this lecture, Yassin praised the Amir for his role as a freedom fighter and as a head of states. And I'm quoting now Katib Yassin, page 42, he states, yes, without the colonial aggression, there would have been a Muslim Algeria with its own structure and central governments. This Algeria would have evolved normally. It would have become a modern nation, same as Egypt. And here he is referring here to the example of Muhammad Ali Pasha and his establishment to the modern states of Egypt. He continued to draw a link between the struggle of 1940s and the resistance of Amir by saying the struggle for independence began by Abdel Qadir goes on, has always carried on.
Can you start to wrap up in your final minute, Mohammed? Please.
I don't want to elaborate more, maybe, because there is no need to talk about the reformist movements, the ulama, and how they seen Al-Amir Abdel Qadir even as, because of this link between Al-Amir as a scholar, as alim, and so they saw him always as an example. And I stop here, and I think if you have any questions later on, we may elaborate more on this. Shukran, assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I'm on time, صح عادل?
Perfect. I don't know if GMT or Algerian mean time, but we can debate that later. Well, one thing, it would be great if I can ask the speakers here on in. Mohammed only did it once. Though the majority of the names I can see who are participating are mostly, I think, from the Algerian community, please do disaggregate and translate some words. I think you used qasid, for example, Mohammed. So just please break it down for our non-Arabic speakers as well. We now transition a few decades on, and we have Professor Martin Evans, Professor of Modern European History, who was also University of Sussex, to take us through the significance of May 1945 as a key historical date, and I think specifically, of course, the 8th of May, I believe the same day that Nazi Germany surrendered, and those denominators. Martin, you have 8 to 10 minutes to take us through the significance of this date.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And very, very pleased to be here amongst Algerian colleagues and friends commemorating this very important date in history. I think really what I want to try and do in my 8 minutes is just to try and put the Algerian struggle into a much broader global history of human rights. And I also want to try briefly to connect it with British history and the wider story of global decolonization. So my starting point is actually a meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill that takes place between the 9th and 12th of August 1941, where they meet just off Newfoundland in Canada. At this point, America is not yet in the war. Britain has been at war for nearly 2 years, and Nazi Germany has invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June. So this meeting is really an attempt to produce a blueprint for a post-Nazi world, what that would look like, what that future would look like. And it arrives at an 8-point charter known as the Atlantic Charter. And interestingly, the third point talks about the global right to national self-determination. And in the months that follow, Churchill tries to qualify this and to say this only applies to occupied Nazi Europe. It doesn't apply to the empires. It certainly doesn't apply to the British Empire. It doesn't apply to the French Empire. But I think what is really interesting is the way in which that idea of an international right to self-determination is taken up between August 1941 and the foundation of the United Nations in April, May, and June, which is a crucial backdrop to what happens in Sétif and Guelma in 1945. We see right across the globe anti-colonial movements seizing upon the anti-colonial Roosevelt to assert national independence, and really, Algeria comes to be at the vanguard of this. I think how the Atlantic Charter arrives in Algeria is in the wake of the torch landings in November, 8th of November 1942. American and British soldiers arrive in Morocco and in Algeria, and leaflets are dropped, which are with the sort of picture of Roosevelt, which really announce that this is some form of liberation, and explicitly cite the Atlantic Charter. Then, in the battles that follow, by May 1943, the Nazis and the Italian fascists have been defeated, and what we see, and I'm sure maybe all of us will agree that within Algerian history, the importance of the power of rumor. So there is a meeting between Roosevelt and the Sultan of Morocco, Mohammed V, in the 22nd of January 1943. And very, very rapidly from that, there develops an idea that independence was promised to Morocco and Algeria. Now, in the wake of the torch landings, we really see arguably the relaunch of the nationalist movement that was heavily repressed under the Third Republic at the end of the 1930s, but also the Vichy regime. And through the figure of Fahad Abbas, plays a crucial role here in composing the Algerian Manifesto, but also the influence of Massali Haj in radicalizing the second version of that. And that manifesto, which is extensive and detailed and talks about the comprehensive failure of assimilation, explicitly cites the Atlantic Charter and calls upon the French to recognize the national right to self-determination. Of course, France has signed up to the United Nations Declaration, which all supported the Atlantic Charter. Now, in the wake of this, and Malika would know much more about this than me, but we see the emergence of probably the first mass-based nationalist movement in France, in Algeria, which is the Association des Amis du Manifeste de la Liberté, and that is founded in March 1944. And it becomes a genuinely mass-based movement. We see the ways in which the Atlantic Charter is an idea, but also belief that the Americans will intervene at the end of the war to bring about independence in Algeria, really takes on a kind of mass, has a mass appeal. And really in the period from, I think, 44 to May 1945, we see a graph of increasing expectations, partly related to the foundation of the United Nations, the imminent foundation of the United Nations, partly founded with the foundation of the Arab League, but also intimately connected to the social conditions in Algeria, but not just in Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia. There's a radicalization because the economy is based on the French war economy. And actually that means it has huge devastating consequences for the local population. And in particular in East Algeria, we're talking about famine conditions in the spring of 1945. So a radical situation. This is the context for the demonstrations that take place on the 8th of May across Algeria, just the day after the defeat or surrender, final surrender of Nazi Germany. And across Algeria, we see Algerian nationalist symbols. So it's the idea that now, at the end of the war, Algeria will be recognized as a nation state. And in Sétif, this does descend into violence. It's a particular incident where a French gendarme intervenes to take a flag away from an Algerian scout. Settlers are then killed, but then there is a huge French counter-repression in Sétif led by the army, But also crucially in Gelma, it's slightly different because it's led by the settlers. There's a kind of like settler defense units which sought out and killed Algerians, but in particular middle-class Algerians, which were seen to be examples of middle-class social and political advancement, which the settlers hated. What I just really want to conclude is I think this is an enormously important politicizing moment. I mean, Kateb Yassine has already been cited, and that's a fantastic speech that he gives about Abdelkader in the late 1940s in Paris. But he talks about May 1945 as being a hugely important politicizing moment for him. But I think here, and what really brought this home to me was an interview with the great Algerian historian Mohamed Harbi, where Harbi said, really, in terms of the end of Algérie française, as soon as rural Algeria had become politicized in the way that was evident in May 1945, French Algeria was finished. The question then was how it was going to be finished and what kind of transformation would take place in the post-1945 world. Okay, that's all I wanted to say, really, in terms of summarising the significance of that moment.
Thank you so much, Martin. With 2 minutes to spare, incredible. Thank you so much. Does that mean Ilyas gets an extra minute, or Wastam Haifa? Since I know Ilyas for a long time, we now transition to Dr. Ilyas Boukarami, who is Director of Content and Global Management at Regent's University, is admittedly an excellent energy economist, but is going back and projecting his historical knowledge on us this afternoon. He'll be discussing the role of the Algerian community abroad during revolution, and I, for one, know Ilyas is a brilliant member of the diaspora who aims to unify and bring at least the London community together for everything from football and culture to history and economics. Ilyas, over to you. And if I can make a request, please mention football as well. Something I know Martin has looked at as well.
I've hung back about talking about that.
We'll come back to that. I have questions. We'll come back to that.
And
Ilyas,
couscous as well. I've got a lot to say about couscous, but there you go.
We'd love to do that gastronomic history. Ilyas, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Mohamed. Thank you, Ambassador Excellency, for hosting this event. But I'd like to say sincerely, thank you very much to two people that are in the crowd, to Lady Olga and to Jessica Morthy, two true Algerians and personal friends as well. And I'm really pleased to see them in the crowd because it will link up to the presentation I will be given. If I can share my screen quickly, I have a few slides. I've given a presentation to 100 kids in Southeast London about the independence. I've used Prezi and they loved it. So hope that you will like it as well. So, Chair, can you allow me to share my screen? I think that is being disabled. Thank you. Yeah, we have to ask. Thank you. Can you see the slides? Perfect. So I will be quickly talking. I'm an economist, nothing to do with history. I speak under the authority of Malika and Martin. I wrote a couple of years ago a book on the history of the Algerian banking system from 1830 to 2010. And we had a chapter for the Algerian Revolution. So that's where it's come from. But I'm interested in more reflecting on the values and the soft power of that revolution. And I will be asking probably a few questions that we can discuss together. But I'm not going to debate a historical event or say this has happened or this didn't happen, just to make things clear. So quickly, the diaspora or the foreign community abroad played a major role in the revolution. And it's called Fédération de France, du FLN, as you all know. They played a major role in internationalizing the cause and financing the cause. That's two key things, because without money there is no war, as you know. And probably in 58, militarily we were down. Algeria with Maurice and Charles, military were really difficult, and the end of the Battle of Algiers. So who took over? I mean, Adel is the football team. Bentifo, Mustafa Zitouni, and Rachid Makhloufi are an example to leave the World Cup and the French national team and come on and to play with a kind of a pop team, the FLN team. Yeah, that's what it was on that time globally. And there are other people who couldn't join or had personal issues, but those three, especially Mustafa Zitouni, I mean, and he passed away a couple of years ago in Nice in a complete silence. Yeah, that's why it is. So as you can see in the slides, you have La Fédération de France, you have few figures there, and Omar Ben Daoud was a member of the Conseil National de la Révolution Algérienne, so he had the highest seat in the highest council. So another key role that I would say, I kept it under the iceberg because most of it hasn't been talked about or didn't receive enough credit from our history. So the problematic for the FLN de France, they had 5 problems. The first one is where to get the money. The second one was how to transfer the money. And the third one is the accommodation of people transferring the money. Yeah, where to host the meetings and fake IDs. So 5 technical problems. As you can imagine, Algerians in the 58, 59, we were about 250,000 Algerians in France, right? That's where we were. So we were 350 in 62. That's what historian says. You can see here in 58, the people who paid their membership to the FLN de France were about 150,000. So we had 150,000 and we collected 267 million French francs. In 59, they collected 365 million. And this being said, it's been reported by Mohamed Bejawi that Ahmed Francis, that we will see a bit later on, who is close friend of Farhad Abbas, who was an amazing financier, despite being a medical doctor. He managed 2 ministers of the GPRA government with the return on investment of these collections. And they constituted about 80% of the budget. So despite being in the war, they were extremely rigorous in financial constraints and in financial management. So how did they solve that problems? As you can see, there is une attestation there, and it was given to a French lady. So the next slide, as you can see, we will see the strategy. So the strategy is the FLN de France had a different strategy. So because when it was created, it was to do military action under French territory. And Mohamed Harbi, that you rightly quoted, and the responsible, I think, Omari from La Région Lyonnaise, they said, this is wrong. You cannot have a military action on a French territory. The challenge is to win the heart of the French population. And how do we get the French population sharing and integrating in our fight? Saïd Bouaziz, who was responsible and was from the Organisation Spéciale, was quite tough and was a man of action. So a lot of ideological debate took place on that level. So as you can see, it was the FLN de France, that's it, from 57, 58, 59, was to inform, to internationalize the cause, to have a major impact. How to make an impact? By having access to inner circles of decision-making processes and centers. So in fact, they got, as you can see, Roland Dumas, who was a solicitor for the briefcase holders, Pierre Vergès, and Roland Dumas was recruited by Christine Philippe. She was the daughter of André Philippe, who was a minister in de Gaulle government. And at a later stage with Chirac, they had an MP called Christian Philippe also, who was the nephew of André as well. So to tell you, is a very deep relation, and it's a penetration in the decision centers. So clearly, without the French, so they were our brothers and sisters. And I have to say this, as despite, and they were calling the briefcase holders collecting the money for the Algerian revolutions, nos frères et nos sœurs. And in fact, as you can see on the picture, you have Maurice Oda that was killed as you know, during the French Revolution, and you have here the picture of Johnson. So the guys in that did this strategy, they based themselves on three key actions. The beauty of the mind. They were extremely intelligent. We can quote Ben Yahya, we can quote Abdelmalik bin Habilas, we can quote Ali Harun, many of them. So they were extremely intelligent in the universities and in the student sectors. And in students and academics, we respect intelligence. So they were able to recruit important French people who provided them with Chanel suitcases and nice luxury cars that were transporting funds for the FLN. So they were elitist, I would say. And I'm sure that this word is not very repeated, but that's what they were. So some of them were extremely ethical. So, and they were extremely wise. Ben Yahya was one of them later on. And even some of them were extremely beautiful and strong. So, and all these were universal values. And I think that was the strategy to internationalize our cause. And they were extremely successful. So finally, there are three key personages I would like the audience to go and reflect on. Those guys were international, universal people. One of them is Mohammed Sadiq bin Yahya, who is, for me, the best member of the cabinet. He was the best higher education ministers. He was ambassadors in London. And then he spent 2 years in the finance ministry between 77 and 79. And on that time, under a socialist economy, he created Circulaire 975, which was to separate microeconomic cost from macroeconomic cost. So he was driven by performance. He was a member of the GPRA. He was also a member of the CNRA, and he was a man of conclusion despite his young age. And he managed to chair the famous meeting of Tripoli in 1962. Mohammed Sadiq bin Yahya is a monument, and he solved the Iranian crisis of the hostage in 1981. So as you know, the next one is, I've mentioned him briefly, is Ahmed Francis, who was a doctor, a medical doctor, man of culture, close friend of Farhat Abbas, a brilliant, I call him the Algerian golden boy, because he was trading in financial markets and investing in government bonds and running, as Bejawi reported, to departments with the return on investment. As a very strong personality, you can see him there next to Karim Belkacem. I think he retired early. He was also the first finance minister for Algeria. The last one for me that I have personally known and I had the pleasure to learn from is Mohammed Seghir Mostafai. He's the Algerian banker, the father of the desert dinar. And Seghir Mostafai was a brilliant personage. And you can see here a letter sent by, and that letter you can see here quickly. This is here. So this is the first time I'm sharing this letter that was sent to me by himself. So you can see this letter is from Anthony Salmon, who was under Secretary of the State for Treasury. And when Mostafai retired after 2 decades of being the governor of the Algerian Central Bank, he created the central bank in 3 months. And then you can see Anthony Salmon, who solved the Iranian crisis with Mohammed Seghir Mostafai, with Ben Yahya, with Rida Malek, who was ambassador in the US. Mohammed Seghir Mostafai, when he decided, so he thanked him and he reiterated the appreciation of the US government to the effort that he did. He was an amazing tennis player, and he was an amazing writer as well. So the conclusion, I think, for us is to say the revolution was universal. That's something. It wasn't local. It was not only national. It was a universal cause. So the second point is to say those guys, they want the heart of the world with universal values: intelligence, ethics, and beauty. And finally, they were global citizens. And I think I will end here. And it's and this, what we call them, is the attribute of their leaderships. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilyas, for a visual aid to accompany a very interesting perspectives and insights. You mentioned Ben Yahya, who I believe, like Ambassador Ben Garrah's predecessor, also served in Moscow, and similarly Mohamed Maush, who was kept at the Franco-Algerian border with l'Indépendance with our footballing colleagues. We now transition, last but not least, we've, as you would have seen, we've done this chronologically. We now go to that special day, 5th of July, 1962, and we're delighted to hear about the celebrations of that specific day that I hear from my own parents. And we have Dr. Malik Al-Rahal, historian and researcher on contemporary Maghreb at CNRS and University of Paris 8 or Paris 8, who will take us through. And I see 4 beautiful slides, which sound about right with 10 minutes. 10 minutes over to you, Malika. And just if I can say one last thing, I don't know what's going on today, but we have 63 participants, and I don't know 63 Algerians or those interested in Algeria not asking questions. C'est vraiment bizarre. So please do start to put your questions into the chat, and we will we'll put them forward to our wonderful panel shortly. Malika, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adel. I would like to greet His Excellency Ambassador Ben Garrah and my colleague speakers, as well as colleagues and friends in the audience. And yes, I'd like to come to the celebrations, not today's celebrations, but the celebrations of 1962. There are many very iconic images that we all know of the celebrations of July, but the reason for speaking of this is that there's sometimes an element of confusion around dates. Is Independence Day on the 3rd or on the 5th of July? And as you know, when there's a little bit of confusion, sometimes there's a little bit of suspicion. Are we hiding anything in our history? And so I thought this was a good opportunity to speak about how things developed over time in 1962 and what was this issue of date. So I'll start there. With July 1962 and 3 really important dates that come in rapid succession. This might be well known to some of you, but maybe not to all of us. There are 3 dates in July that mark independence and that make it happen. The first is the 1st of July with the referendum of self-determination. This referendum was a French demand, but it also served to assert an element of existence of the Algerian people in the FLN thinking at the time, the electoral body embodying, if you'd like, what was going to be the legal Algerian national body. The second date is the 3rd of July 1962. This is the date at which the transfer of sovereignty took place between the French authorities and the Algerian Provisional Executive. This takes place in Boumerdes, in Rocher Noir, from the French authorities to Abderrahman Fares. And then finally, the 5th is the day of the official independence, echoing the capitulation of the city of Algiers in 1830, and thus appearing as a reversal of colonization, which also marks the arrival within the country of Algerian authorities who had been abroad, and notably the Algerian provisional government. So 3 moments in a very short period of time, which means that the enthusiasm from one tends to flow over to the next, but also that these events can be prepared, can be staged, and that they can be separate. And this is really important if you think, for example, of the Congolese independence in 1960. Maybe some of you remember a very famous speech by Patrice Lumumba on the day of independence, so June 30th, 1960. This is a very famous speech, a very important and combative speech. But one of the things we all remember is that it took place in the presence of the King of Belgium. And this does not happen in Algeria because of this division in 3 separate events. The transfer of sovereignty takes place on the 3rd. This is when the French flag goes down, the Algerian flag goes up. But the celebrations, those take place in the absence of the French. And this symbolically is extremely important. And I'd like to insist on this element of preparation, organization, and mastery of the rhythm of events, if you'd like. Now, this calendar, from a popular point of view, is a little bit different. And here we need to think in a longer time span. We need to go back to earlier events in 1962 and begin with, in fact, the beginning of festivities and popular festivities after the ceasefire of March 19th, 1962. This is when the first festivities de facto took place. In some cases, celebrations took place even in the mountains. Combatant groups started celebrating, not always immediately, because they didn't always learn the news of the ceasefire immediately, or sometimes they didn't believe it, to be fair. But little by little, civilian populations would go up to celebrate within the Maquis with the combatants, organize dinners, put on their best clothes, and have small celebrations in the mountains. There were also small celebrations within families and within neighborhoods. And we have only very few pictures of these celebrations from the month of March, because they tended to take place within the confines of the Algerian neighborhoods and not to go out into the open in the broader cities or the broader neighborhoods. Here we have a picture of March celebrations in the region of Dra al-Mizan, for example. So it feels like the entire population of this small section of this small region are brought together, men in the forefront, women at the back, children in the middle, everybody trying to be in their best clothings, finger in the air, probably singing Yarham Shuhada, which was the chant that went with the gesture, peace to the martyrs. And these festivities never stopped, in a sense. They began in March, but they continued well into the summer and later into the fall, because they kept being relaunched as people came home. So soldiers leaving the ALN and going back to their families were the occasion for new celebrations, people coming back from abroad, anywhere up to 300,000 refugees living in Tunisia and Morocco coming back into the country, people within regroupment camps, i.e. colonial concentration camps, being allowed to circulate again within the country. So families all over the country were being reunited, and every reunification of the family was the opportunity to celebrate. Now, these festivities and commemorations also held their share of mourning and sadness, because with people came news. And so there was both joy and mourning, and all of this often took place in the very same time, with people going from dancing to mourning, or trying to sometimes hide their emotions in order to allow for everyone to express their joy. So March and then into the transitional period, these celebrations were somewhat limited in space and time. Now, this was, of course, no longer the case in July. This was no longer the case precisely because the transfer of sovereignty had already taken place, and therefore public space was now Algerian space. Officially, there were a number of instructions inviting Algerian people not to start celebrating before the 5th of July, but try explaining this or convincing people that they weren't supposed to celebrate. It didn't work very well. It worked to a limited extent. People tended to celebrate the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd within their neighborhoods, and the excitement kept growing until the 5th, to this moment of visual assertion of existence of the people if you'd like. The fifth, everywhere in the country, was very much the apex of excitement, with people dancing, people singing, people going into trance, forgetting where they were. I've had witnesses tell me that they started celebrating and didn't understood how they arrived into the next city. Maybe they got into a car, maybe they got into a truck, they danced their way to the next city. One witness in writing explains that he was 4 years old, and when he saw this huge crowd in the city of Shlaf, the only word that comes to him is gharaqt, I drowned in this sea of people and this ocean of rhythm. The rhythm, of course, was Tahya al-Jazair, which answers the Algerie Française rhythm that had been sung by the OAS. And in these July celebrations, and I'd like to get a couple of pictures, the main tool for the celebration, if you'd like, is very much the truck, because the truck serves as a stage. It allows participants in these celebrations to both be on a stage and show themselves in an assertion of existence, but also gives them a vantage point to be able to see the crowd and see this people visually in existence, not only underground and in the form of the resistance, but also visually and symbolically in the streets. These July celebrations, they're very different from March because they're in public space, not only in the Algerian quarters, but they also go through the European quarters. In some places, Europeans are invited to participate. They don't always accept. Sometimes they do, but this is rare.
Malika, could you arrive at a conclusion in a minute? Perfect.
And there's very much this element of transgression through stories that you have definitely heard from in the stories of your parents or grandparents, where in these celebrations, there's always a question of women going out into the street, not coming back overnight, women wondering how their parents allowed them to go out and dance in the street, because all of this felt like it was happening in a safe space, in a space that had been made Algerian in a sense and was therefore protected. Again, this is an intense moment of joy, but it also constantly recalls the mourning, the sadness, and the pain with the chants and the Allah yarham shuhada over and